All right, welcome to another deep dive with us. You know how this works. You give us the source material and we take a deep dive into it. And today we're looking at excerpts from 19th century issues in the 21st century by the Appalachian Guerrilla. Sometimes I forget that folks listening haven't read all this stuff already like we have. So just to be clear, the whole point of this is to look at how ways of thinking and doing things, stuff that took root way back in the 19th century or even earlier, how that stuff is still shaping our world today.
It's really about uncovering the historical DNA embedded in our modern systems and expectations.
Yeah, exactly. Like all this stuff that we just take for granted, so much of it has roots that go way deeper than we realize. And for those of you who love getting to the heart of things, understanding of the why behind stuff, I think you'll find it fascinating to see how these historical events basically set the stage for what we now consider totally normal.
Absolutely. We're going to be focusing on the idea of paradigms in this deep dive.
Right, paradigms. So for everyone listening, let's unpack that word a little bit.
Sure.
I mean, it's a big one. It's kind of the foundation for everything we're going to talk about today.
Definitely.
The author describes a paradigm as, like, the underlying understanding you have when something is mentioned. It's the accepted way of approaching something. They even make a little joke about finding evidence of paradigms in corporate jargon and those motivational posters you see everywhere.
Right, like those teamwork makes the dream work posters.
Exactly. But obviously, it's a lot bigger than just office culture.
Right.
Oh.
Oh, absolutely. Paradigms are much more fundamental than that. It's like the invisible architecture of how we think and operate as a society.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is how these paradigms, these accepted ways of operating, didn't just appear out of nowhere. They were built up over time, often as responses to very specific circumstances and challenges that people faced.
Right, they were solutions to problems.
Yeah.
And sometimes those solutions ended up sticking around, even when the original problems changed or faded away.
Okay, so let's dive into one of the big paradigms the author tackles,
Mm-hmm.
this expectation of exponential market growth. It's like we're hardwired to believe that the economy, the markets, everything should just keep going up and up forever. Where does that idea come from?
Well, the author draws a really interesting connection between this ingrained economic expectation and the actual historical phenomenon of exponential population growth.
Well, that's interesting.
Especially in the West, following the 1860s. It was a period of incredible change and expansion. You had the discovery of oil, which really fueled rapid technological advancement. I mean, think about it. In a single lifetime, people went from horse-drawn carriages to airplanes.
Yeah.
That kind of dramatic, rapid progress really fostered a sense that things would just keep growing and getting better, in all areas of life, including the economy.
That makes a lot of sense. And it wasn't just technology that was booming. Governments also started to expect this constantly growing population to support things like, well, borrowing for social programs.
Exactly. They built systems that relied on more and more people coming along to keep everything running.
It's like they baked that assumption of endless growth right into the foundation of things.
Right. And this actually ties into another fascinating point the author makes. This whole demographic shift with younger generations moving away from traditional family structures in search of work, it actually triggered a change in how society thought about taking care of its elders.
Oh, how so?
Well, the author gives this really compelling example. The first old age insurance Ponzi scheme in Germany back in the 1890s.
A Ponzi scheme for old age insurance.
Yeah. And it wasn't some random idea. It directly arose from the emigration of a lot of young Germans to America in the 1850s. You see, this mass exodus of young people disrupted the traditional model of families taking care of their older members.
Because there weren't enough young people left to support the older generation.
Exactly. And that's how the paradigm of elder care shifted from a primarily family responsibility to a state-run system.
It's fascinating how these seemingly unconnected events can lead to such fundamental shifts in how we think and operate as a society.
It really highlights how our current systems are often built on responses to very specific historical problems.
Okay, so let's move on to something that feels very much a part of our current landscape.
Yeah.
Agricultural and petroleum subsidies. It's almost taken for granted that these are necessary for basic food and energy production in America, right?
Right. And the author points out that this idea really took hold in the early 1900s during World War I. When the U.S. mobilized for the war, the government was surprised to find a lot of malnourishment among its citizens.
Really?
Yeah, it was a real concern. So to address this, they started heavily subsidizing agricultural production. It was meant to be a wartime measure to ensure a healthy fighting force. But what's interesting is that this temporary fix kind of became a permanent part of how we think about food production.
So even though the original crisis passed, the solution stuck around.
Exactly. And now it's almost a given that these subsidies are essential even in peacetime.
It makes you wonder how many other aspects of our lives were designed as temporary fixes that just never went away.
It's a great question to consider.
The author then goes into income tax, which is something most of us accept as, well, just a fact of life. But the author points out that a lot of people feel like they're paying for basically no reason, especially knowing that the government can technically just print more money.
Right. It raises a fundamental question about why income tax is considered so essential.
Exactly.
And the author provides some historical context here. They explain that income tax was introduced in 1913 as a way to manage the currency supply and stabilize markets. Back then, you had these wild swings in the amount of money in circulation, leading to booms and busts.
So it was originally meant to smooth things out, not necessarily to be the primary source of government funding.
Precisely. That came later. But what's really important to note is how deeply this income tax paradigm is now woven into so many other parts of our lives. It's not just about government revenue anymore. Our entire employment system is structured around it.
Oh, I see what you mean. Like how your proof of citizenship is often tied to having a job.
Exactly. And then you have things like health insurance deductions, retirement contributions, all handled through payroll, all tied to this income tax system.
It's like one solution created this whole web of dependencies that are now super hard to untangle.
Absolutely. It's a classic example of how paradigms can have far-reaching consequences.
Okay, so speaking of retirement, the author also talks about this modern idea that the way to a secure retirement is through long-term ETF investments. Basically, putting your money in the stock market and hoping it grows over time.
Right. The idea that your retirement security is tied to the performance of the market.
Where did that way of thinking come from?
Well, the author traces it back to the Depression era. With pay freezes and all the economic uncertainty, companies started offering pensions as a way to attract and keep workers. It was a promise of a more stable retirement.
I see. But those pensions ultimately became too expensive for many companies to maintain.
Exactly. And that's where the shift towards the 401k model came in.
Right, where the responsibility for retirement savings shifted from the company to the individual employee.
And the author argues that this shift, while seeming to give individuals more control, actually contributed to things like market hyperinflation and those massive speculative bubbles that eventually led to the 2008 financial crisis.
It's a pretty bold claim.
It is, but it really highlights how the way we structure these systems can have unintended consequences, sometimes on a huge scale.
And this ties into another paradigm the author mentions. This idea that the performance of the market, things like GDP growth, is the primary indicator of how well the country is doing overall.
Right, like if the market is going up, everything must be great.
Which makes sense if your retirement savings are all tied up in the market.
Exactly. And if we connect this with the idea of all this capital-seeking returns, the author then talks about a really worrying trend: the commodification of basic institutions.
What does that mean exactly?
It means that when there's so much money looking for places to invest, even fundamental things like housing become financial assets. The author gives the example of corporations buying up tons of single-family homes and then packaging the rental income into these things called rental-backed securities.
Oh, right. So they're basically turning people's homes into financial instruments.
Exactly. And that's a really concerning trend because it means that access to basic needs is increasingly determined by market forces.
It's like the very things we need to survive are becoming commodities.
And that can have some pretty disturbing consequences.
Okay, so shifting gears a bit, the author also addresses a question that comes up a lot. Why doesn't the U.S. have high-speed rail, like many other developed countries?
Right, that's a common one. And the usual explanation involves lobbying by car companies and the oil industry. But the author actually offers a slightly different perspective. They argue that promoting cheap energy and mass-producing cars was a deliberate choice, driven in large part by the need to create jobs, especially in the mid-20th century.
So it wasn't just about powerful corporations blocking progress, but more about the government prioritizing a different set of goals.
Exactly. They focused on individual car ownership and mass employment in the auto industry. At one point, something like 1 in 5 American workers were connected to the auto industry.
Wow, that's huge. So in a way, the lack of high-speed rail is kind of a legacy of that focus on the auto industry.
It is, and it illustrates a crucial point the author makes. A lot of these systemic issues weren't necessarily created out of malice or a desire to cause problems.
They were often solutions to specific problems that existed at a certain point in time.
Exactly. And the problem is that those original problems might not be the biggest concerns anymore, but the systems built around them are still here.
Which brings us to the author's main takeaway, right?
Yeah.
We need to constantly question our assumptions.
Absolutely. Just because something worked in the past doesn't mean it's the best way to do things now. And the author actually predicts that the next 50 years will bring more change than the last 100. So we need to be ready to adapt and evolve our thinking.
Yeah, it's like we're living in a time of accelerating change.
We are. So the key takeaway here is that a lot of the things we take for granted, the systems we live with, they have roots in specific historical contexts. And those contexts might not be relevant anymore.
It's a powerful reminder to not just accept things as they are, but to always be questioning why things are the way they are.
Right, because what seemed like a good idea in the 19th century might not be the best solution for the challenges we face in the 21st century.
It really makes you think, what other aspects of our lives are built on these outdated paradigms?
Right, what about education, healthcare, our political systems? It's worth considering.
And that brings up a final thought. If so many of our current systems are basically responses to past crises, what new paradigms are being formed right now in response to the challenges we face today?
That's the big question, isn't it? What are the solutions to climate change, to technological disruption, to global inequality? And what unintended consequences might those solutions create down the line?
It's a lot to think about.
It is. But it's important to be aware of these historical patterns and to approach the future with a critical eye.
Well said. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us. We hope it's given everyone listening some food for thought.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure.
And for all of you listening, keep those questions coming, and we'll keep diving deep.